think we'll get going. I'd like to welcome everybody today to our virtual gathering presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. We're the statewide membership-based historic preservation organization. My name is Beverly Thomas, and on behalf of the Preservation Alliance, I'm pleased to welcome you to Dry Stone Walls, History, Assessment, and Construction with Brian Post of the Stone Trust. This program is the third in our series called Old House and Barn Expo on the Road. Because of COVID, we've replaced our popular biennial Old House and Barn Expo with a series of over 20 Zoom programs throughout 2021, as well as some in-person events we'll be hosting later in the year. We love getting you and other Old House and Barn enthusiasts together to share practical information from highly qualified presenters, make connections, and offer you a dose of energy and inspiration too. Many thanks to our sponsors for making these programs possible, and to all of you who are supporters of our critical work that helps to advance efforts to save and steward special places around New Hampshire. A few housekeeping points I'd like to mention before we begin. I'd like to remind you that we are recording today's session and thank you and ask you to please stay muted to keep the background noise down. You may also want to spotlight the host during his presentation by choosing the side-by-side option under the features, the view feature on the top right-hand side of your screen. Brian's presentation will run about 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. I'll wrap up the program by 1 o'clock, but Brian has agreed to stay on for an additional 15 minutes if you'd like to continue the discussion. Because of our great numbers today, I ask you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screens if you have a question, and we'll try our best to address them at the end of the program. And before we close, we'll select a lucky winner of our Expo door prize the Stone Trust has generously donated. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Brian Post is a stonework teacher and practitioner. He currently works as Education and Training Director at the Stone Trust, a nonprofit based in southern Vermont, whose mission is to preserve and advance the art and craft of stone walling. He is one of 8 people in the United States to hold certification as a master craftsman from Great Britain's Dry Stone Walling Association, and is also certified by them as a dry stone wall instructor and examiner. Post is also a licensed landscape architect in Vermont and owns Standing Stone LLC, a business that focuses on designing and building walls and other features using traditional dry stone and historic masonry techniques. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Brian. Thank you very much, Brian.
All right, thank you, Beverly. All right, so we're gonna get right into it. I've got a pretty aggressive schedule here to keep on this presentation, so we'll see how we do. Just a little picture here at the Stone Trust of a workshop going on where folks come to learn dry stone walling, and we've got workshops for folks that have never lifted a stone before, all the way up to very advanced people, and it will either way really change the way you look at stone walls and build them. So we'll hope to see a bunch of you there in the future. I'm going to plunge right into this. We're going to start off talking a little bit about some history. This is a picture from over in England, and I've traveled there many times and done a lot of my training and work there. But I included this picture. All these dark lines that you see are stone walls. And in England, a lot of the traditional knowledge was written down hundreds of years ago because they were specifying dry stone walls as property boundaries. And they, as part of that, recorded how the walls had to be built. So that's some of the earliest written instructions and specifications for dry stone walls. And this is a great photo because in a way, a lot of New England used to look like this at one point in time. So all those walls that we have in the woods now, it actually looks something like this in many of those areas. Just a little bit about the dry stone technology. It's one of the oldest and most resilient building methods. And there's structures that are existing still built with dry stone that date back, 3,000 to even 5,000 years old in a few instances. And when I say dry stone, what I'm talking about is that there's no mortar involved. It's just the stone. And a wet work is called that because you're dealing with wet mortar as you're building. So this is done dry. This particular photo here is of Brock Duncaraway on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. And these were towers that were built about ballpark of 1,200 years ago. And often about 40 feet tall like this, entirely dry. They're really neat structures. Most of them are in very, very remote places in Scotland. I'm getting a little bit of background noise there. So can you double check to make sure that you have clicked mute, please, on your screen? A little closer to home, this is the Brockway Mills Dam in Reading, Vermont. This is a dry stone dam. And these are all over New England. And it shows some of the scale and structure that a lot of the dry stone work can really hold. These portholes would have been where the water was coming through into the mill building. That's not there anymore. That's about 5 feet high. So the whole wall's over 15 feet high. The backside in this case would have been, it's basically a retaining wall. It would have a clay backfill behind that to retain the water. But as we get into this, what I'm going to be talking about is that the wealth of knowledge with dry stone walls, it's not my way of building. It's a wealth of knowledge that goes back hundreds of years. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you. It's well documented, well recorded. We know what works and what doesn't work. These practices are understood by professionals all over the world. A little bit about some of the history. This is a beautiful picture of the Carr Bridge, or the old Carr Bridge in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And this was built in 1840. That's a little bit after the real heyday of a lot of dry stone work was done. But again, the technology works really well. This has lasted far longer than most concrete bridges last today. So when we talk about the stone walls themselves, a lot of the purpose of the walls was based around agriculture. And what we find is that when we're looking to try to date, say, how old a wall was, you can look a lot at the land use patterns. You have to pay attention to the fact that most of the walls were built a good chunk of time after the land was originally cleared. Originally, when they cleared, they would have had wood for fences, and then later stumps that they would pull out for fences. And it'd often be a generation later that they would have had a lack of wood, and then the soil erosion was often a problem. So you had a lot of stone coming to the surface, and that's when the walls were built. Overall in New England, the real heyday of the dry stone walling period was about 1775 to 1825. The vast majority of the agricultural dry stone walls were built during that period. You had the wool prices were very high, and they were quickly trying to throw up fences for the sheep. So most of these walls were built really just in about a 40 to 50 year time period. The picture we're looking at here is a wall in Claremont, New Hampshire. This is actually, it's hard to tell from the photo, this is a Scottish style of building called a Galloway dyke, where they have small stones at the bottom, large stones at the top. Dyke is the Scottish word for wall. Very typical photo of upland sheep wall, single stack construction, often called a lace wall. You can see through it a lot. And these were very hastily built out of larger stones. You can look at the walls and determine a bit about what they were for. This is clearly an animal fence. Given the size of the stones, this would not have been tilled land. This was just erected as a fence. If you look at a wall, this is while we were starting to restore this, that has all these small stones built up. We know that this area was tilled land, that they were pulling out small stones. Occasionally, you'll come up with a wall that has a huge volume of very small stones, like less than 3 inches in diameter. And you can almost guarantee they were probably growing a root crop in one of the neighboring fields, potatoes or carrots or something like that. And that's why they were picking all those very, very tiny stones out. You can also tell a little bit about the agricultural patterns just by the volume of stone. This is in a site that was continuously farmed for over 200 years. And this wall was in places about 20 feet thick, if you can call it a wall. It was kind of a dumped heap at that point. But in the core of it, there was actually a stacked wall. Another thing when you're trying to determine dates of stonework, and this applies to all stonework, look for the tool marks. And I could probably give a whole presentation about this, but this is at a quarry over, an abandoned quarry over at New Hampshire. And you can see here, if you look at my cursor, there's drill holes here, and that would have been from splitting the stones apart. This was done with what's called pins and wedges, or feathers and wedges often. That went into widespread use around 1830. So if you're seeing these drill marks, it tells you it's most likely after 1830, really common after 1835. This particular piece is a little unusual. They've got two deeper, larger holes and then some smaller ones. And this is probably fairly early on, because they were refining, like, well, how, you know, do I still need these old-fashioned holes that are bigger to split a piece like this? The inset photo here, you can see these small slots drilled. This is predominantly done before the round holes, so pre-1830s. These would be done just by carving a slot with a flat-bladed chisel, a very narrow chisel, and then inserting a flat wedge. There was some mechanization of this attempted in the early 1800s, but primarily that was hand done and is earlier on. This is, to give you a sense of it, this is working his granite blocks from that abandoned quarry using these pins and feathers. So you're drilling a hole and then inserting these pins and feathers that expand as you tap them in, and it leaves these very characteristic half round hole marks. And you can even get into dating those a little bit more, because you can, with practice, identify whether it was done with a power drill or drilled by hand using a grinding chisel, or a drilling chisel, they would often call it. More modern ones might be called a star chisel with a cross blade. If you see saw marks on, this is a saw cutting a stone, it gives a real flat, smooth surface. That's gonna date you probably to after 1880, unless you're very close to either a marble or slate quarry. Those are about the only two stones that were sawn commonly earlier than that. So that can be a real indication of more modern stonework. And here what we're actually doing is chiseling off a saw cut so that it looks historic, or has the appearance of historic stonework. I'm gonna get into talking a little bit more about the terminology involved with dry stone work, and we'll get into how we build it as a real quick synopsis of some of the history, and we can pick up more in the questions. So some terminology, common terminology that you'll hear me use with dry stone work. This is a double wall, and we'll get into talking about some other types of construction a little bit more as well. But double wall, there's separate stones on each side of the wall. The infill's filled with harding. You've got through stones connecting between the sides, and a cope on top, something heavy. Sometimes it's a capstone to tie the top together. And it makes for a very strong construction. Couple more terms here. These images are also going to be in a handout that you'll get emailed to you as well. So I'm not going to dive into them with explaining every little thing. You'll notice walls are tapered inward. That's called a batter. And most traditional stone walls are going to have that. The square vertical sided stone wall with a flat top came into fashion really after 1950 or so. Now, there are some areas in New Hampshire where there are older walls that are built square, less common in other areas that you would see that. But this structure was developed to be the longest lasting, most durable structure that was efficient to build with all the different size stones that you'll find as you're constructing a field wall. So it really has a lot to do with function. Everything about this is about function. When I'm talking about stones a little bit more in depth, every stone has a length, a width, and a height. And obviously it's easy to identify if it's a nice rectangular stone, but stones come in all different shapes. All this kind of shapes, very easy to work with. Something that has a parallel top and bottom, cylinders, prisms, flat stuff, blocks. These tend to be a little bit more challenging, tend to need a little bit more shaping or a little bit more careful precision. Pyramids are really tough to work with, one of the hardest shapes. I'm just kind of buzzing along here. We're going to talk about some basic rules for building as applied in a double stack wall. And this is one of the most important principles. What we're trying to do is increase our friction as much as possible. So length in, when we're looking down at a course in the wall, all the stones have their length in. And so many people nowadays like to build like this, where again, looking at the top of the wall, all the stones have a long straight side facing out on the wall. This makes a very weak wall. And if you can think about it in terms of stacking firewood, firewood's always stacked with the pieces perpendicular to the stack till you get to the end of a stack at least. And if you ever tried to stack firewood so all the straight, smooth split faces were facing out in the stack, it wouldn't take you very long to know that doesn't work. So the same principles applied here, and it's absolutely critical for strength. Harding, the heart of the wall is the infill, and how well that's done has a tremendous effect on the strength of the wall. That's taking the place of the mortar. And what we have here is you want that laid tight, packed tight, filling all the voids, stacked fairly level. You can imagine a wedge stone like this. This is cross section cut through the wall view. As weight's applied is going to start forcing these stones apart. And a very common mistake in building today is people use gravel or crushed stone in the core of the wall. And that really just acts as a lot of ball bearings in your wall. It doesn't hold the structure of the wall. And if you've ever climbed up a pile of gravel or crushed stone, you know how easily it rolls down under your feet. And that's what it's doing in the core of your wall. So if you can shovel it, don't use it as harding. Crossing joints, most people pick up on this pretty quickly, but it's just like brickwork. You don't want to see vertical joints running up through the wall. So each joint is crossed by another stone. And this is what we don't like to see, where we have these vertical joints. And the vertical joints are called running joints in dry stonework. So each vertical joint is called a running joint. Something that's maybe not quite vertical, but where there's still not really good structural contact across might be called a zipper joint. It's really important to build to the line. You're trying to get a flat surface on the outside of the wall. And this is important from a practical sense in terms of when you're using it as a livestock barrier. If the side of the wall has stones protruding out of it, animals can climb that, especially sheep. It's also important aesthetically, and then practically in terms of building. If you don't keep a nice even surface, you end up getting overhangs and all kinds of structural compromises. So you're lining up the tips of the stone. In mortared stonework, they might line up where one stone makes contact to the next one. Here, we'd want to line up the farthest protruding point of the stone. This is a cross-section view. That's plan view looking at a course. And keeping this structure, and we use string lines between batter frames to make that possible to build a really even face. And then your harding fills in the spaces between on the inside of the wall. Building level is something that's also really important as you're building walls. And this applies down the length of a course. So if you have a wall like this that's going up a steep hill, you can see the stonework, whether it's in an even course or a bit more random, is still keeping a level line. And that's a little bit of an illustration. Even working odd shapes, you still try to keep a level line in the face of the wall. And in cross section, it's even more important. This, you can kind of get a sense, cross section of the wall, that's going to hold weight. Nothing's going to move as that ages. Whereas this, everything's trying to slide this way as it ages. So really important to keep things level as you're building. That's the 5 basic rules of dry stonework, and they apply to just about all aspects of dry stonework. There's lots of different styles that we might adopt, but they're still trying to pay attention. So as I'm setting stones on the wall when I'm building, this is what I'm asking myself for just about every stone silently in my head. Is it length in? Is it avoid, is it, that's terrible writing there. Does it avoid creating a running joint? Sorry about the typo. In other words, is it crossing a joint below it? Is it to the line? Is the tip of the stone brought out to the line of the wall? Can I build on top of it? That's my question about being level. I need to think about, can I build on top of it? And ideally, it's going to be the same height as the stone next to it. And if all of those answer yes, we leave it on the wall. You pin it, you hard it from the back, and it's good to go. If something answers no, I might have a specific reason why I'm going to allow it. Is it length in? Well, it's pretty much a square stone. It's going to be fine either way. But always, can I build on top of it? Does it have a flat top to build on top of? That's critical. Notice none of these are really talking about how tightly it's fitting to its neighbor. And we're not building a jigsaw puzzle per se. We're following the structural rules. And that's a really important aspect to think about. I'm going to transition a little bit to talking about common styles of walling. Some of these I've already mentioned. So the double stack is what we just looked at. And this is a very, very common style of building, especially if you're dealing with somewhat smaller stone. It tends to be one of the strongest styles of building. It's a little bit slower to build. So in that wool craze, when they were throwing up miles of wall very, very quickly, and I didn't actually mention this, but a fun fact is that by 1871, they did a census of dry stone walls in New England and New York State. And there was over 250,000 miles of agricultural dry stone wall at the time. That's enough to go around the equator 10 times if that was all strung together. So tremendous amount of wall. A lot of them were these single stack walls, larger stone, ideally still kind of stacked like a stack of firewood with the length going across the wall, and you get that kind of a texture. A hybrid between the two is the Galloway wall, very common in Southwest Scotland, which is where it's named for. And you take the smaller stones, do a double stack at the bottom, and then you put your big boulders on top. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive because you're lifting the big stones higher, but if you can imagine a sort of rounded top boulder, it's very hard to structurally build a double stack with smaller stones on top of that. So this is very strong by comparison. And a little bit, touching again on history, you'll find the double stack closer to houses and more refined areas and areas that were farmed longer. And the single stack is going to be in the more remote areas that weren't farmed as long. And to some degree, also keep in mind, barbed wire was invented in about 1875 or so, or might have been 1868, somewhere right around there. After barbed wire came in, there wasn't much incentive to build dry stone walls for agricultural purposes. A little bit more detail talking about batter. We talk about that usually in terms of a ratio. So for 6 inches up, 1 inch in, that's a very common batter. 1 to 12 is a very steep batter. Usually the typical range would be a 1 to 6 to maybe a 1 to 8. It depends a little bit on the stone you're using, but that's a common range. And these are, when I mentioned batter frames, we're doing something with wood and rebar so that we have something to hold string lines so we can build a nice straight face of wall. Sorting stone really helps when you're building particularly a more refined wall. This is during a dry stone wall certification test where you're taking down a section of wall and then rebuilding it. And sorting it out, you're using your bigger stone first at the bottom of the wall. This is again for a double stack wall. This strip out pattern of sorting would be on both sides of the wall typically. And you've kept your through stones separate, your copes separate. Working your way up to smaller and smaller stone as you build up the wall because the wall is getting narrower and it's that every stone has its place. The through stones are an absolutely critical feature of a double stack wall. Tying those two sides together. When I go out in the woods, I'm looking at historic walls. Very often there'll be a section maybe that's preserved a fair bit better than the rest. And lo and behold, that section had through stones in it and none of the rest did. That has all fallen down. Historically, through stone material was often carried by cart or wagon long distances if they didn't have it on site. So it was known to be very important to the structure of the wall. And again, that's a photo from a workshop at the Stone Trust. There's a great book about, I'll just throw it out. There's a great book about history of stone walls called Sermons in Stone by Susan Allport. And this is Susan Allport taking one of our courses. So it's a fun feature. Copes and caps, there's all different ways to finish the top of the wall. And it's very important structurally. This is a workshop that we did out in Minneapolis area, Minnesota, where we have another training site. And this is a kind of a bouldery cope with some big glacial till stones that came down the glacier material. And the point of the coping is to add weight to the top of the wall. And this is a workshop down at the stone supplier in Massachusetts called the Stone Yard. Not too far probably from a lot of you folks. And here we're doing a vertical coping where these are slabs that have been trimmed to shape, kind of a half circle shape, and they've all been lined up. And that's equivalent weight on the top of the wall to putting, 14-inch tall boulders on top of there. But because they're all slabs, they're very easy to lift up, very easy to trim to an even line. Makes a really, really strong finish to the wall. Tying the two sides together and adding a lot of weight to the top increases the wall in height and pulls down all these little pins. And it's a very fast way to do it. Photo from over in England, again at a training center where they're teaching walling over there. A cope on a slight slant or diagonal is a very common thing to see in some places. If you go down to Kentucky, you'll see that everywhere. And obviously another photo of a vertical cope with a different type of stone in the background there. Flat caps. This is a project that I built back in 2013, terraced garden. Again, you can see coping on the upper wall, but where people wanted to be able to sit on the walls, we did a flat cap. And that's a good time to do a flat cap, but generally coping is going to be stronger than a flat cap wall. And it also is faster to do. It's more efficient. But flat caps, very important, they go all the way across the wall, acting like a through stone, essentially capping the top of the wall. And the thicker they can be, the better. So if, I wouldn't do a cap any less than 3 or 4 inches thick. A 2-inch thick piece of bluestone doesn't have enough weight to really hold everything down below it. I'm not going to get into this too much, but there's always questions about foundations when we're rebuilding an old wall or building a new wall. And when you're talking about foundations, the key is we're trying to minimize soil movement, and we can do that through compaction and removing water that's going to freeze and cause heaving. So that's our goals as we're doing that. And compaction, it really helps to use a compactor like this type. Is called a jumping jack or a rammer type compactor. In modern construction, a lot of folks use these vibratory plate compactors, and they don't provide much compaction. You're going to be much better off stomping with your feet, in all honesty. A little bit of information there. And this is, again, for more modern, new construction, but we'll often use 3/4 inch to 2.5 inch aggregate that's clear, doesn't have the fines in it, so water's going to drain through, somewhere around 8 inches to 18 inches deep. And that's minimizing the amount of freeze thaw cycles under your wall. It adds to the stability. We always get lots of questions about retaining walls. Retaining walls are really built very much like the double stack dry stone walls that we talked about for agricultural use. And so one of the things that happens is a lot of people just build a front face of a wall, and they don't build the backing, the back of wall part of it. So the wall doesn't have enough mass to be stable. So this is a dry stone retaining wall I built a few years back. This is all actually stone that was washed up onto the property from Hurricane Irene, and we built a beautiful wall with it after it had been deposited in their driveway. Typical construction detail cross section of a retaining wall. You'll notice everything's tipped back a little bit, and some people are going to be like, "Oh, but you said build everything level." Well, in a retaining wall, we're retaining force. We've got force pushing on the wall. If you tip everything back subtly, then in order for this wall to push outward or to bulge, the stones have to go uphill. And stones don't like to go uphill, so it adds to the strength in a retaining wall situation. Another detail I'm just going to call out real quick here. I know we're going to be running short on time, so I'm going to jump on, but be aware of filter fabric. It's overused in modern construction projects. I'm going to jump ahead here. Evaluating walls, some things to look for, and we've hit on a few of these things. Harding, this is a complete failure of harding. There's shoveled gravel into the core of the wall. If you see this, that's not an acceptable build. This is a wall that's about 3 feet thick and about 18 inches high, and it fell down largely because of the harding. I'm not going to get into all those terminologies just because I think I'm going to run out of time, but we'll hit them as we hit these next couple slides. This is a wall that was built up in Maine. Pretty nice material, rectangular, nothing wrong with that. But when I start seeing long faces like this, I say that looks like a through stone that's been put the wrong way around, and we call that tracing when you have the long edge of the stone out. And lo and behold, looking a little bit farther down the wall, we see this, and this is 2 months after this wall was built. It's a single stack construction, many places only about 4 inches thick. There's no way there's enough mass to retain even that well-draining pea stone. And in addition to that, it was built actually vertically, and they tried to make it look thicker just by placing some stones on top of the pea stone in the back. So I see landscape architects and engineers even draw walls that look like this, and it's never going to work. Might not always fall down in 2 months, but it's never going to work long term. Compared to this wall, this is a freestanding wall built with pretty random rubble, but there's structurally, it's very good. Now you can say, well, I don't like the random line on the top. That's an aesthetic thing. This was built by workshop participants that had never built a wall before in their lives. Structurally, it's far better than the photos that we just looked at by taking the workshops at the Stone Trust. You know, there's a few minor issues, but it's not bad. You can see a little bit, there's different people working different sections, but still largely following the structural principles of dry stone walling. This is a great wall from down in Massachusetts. This was historically a very well-built wall. It actually had capstones that were hand cut out of granite, nice rectangular stones. In fact, this is a capstone, that's another capstone. And it was rebuilt by some masons that were used to doing veneer work. And they literally took all of the capstones and stood them up on edge in the wall. They took all the harding and used it as pins in the wall. About 2 months after they did this, it started falling down again. That's a view of a capstone stood up on edge in the wall. I hope most of you can sense that structurally that's never going to work long term. The comments down there were basically everybody was saying what they were working so hard. Well, they're giving themselves future work because that's just going to fall down very quickly. And in that case, there was a really good obvious precedent from some of the other walls there of how they should have been built. Another wall to look at, this is better built. It's certainly reasonably structural. But again, long faces makes me think a lot of this material is what we call traced, where they put those long faces out. And then I see like a running joint running all the way up through the wall. It makes me a little concerned. I get up close to the wall, and this is what I can see falling through the wall. So again, some indication that this wall is better built than some of the others we've looked at, but I would not accept this if a contractor built this for me. When you get into projects, if you're not doing a wall yourself and you want to hire someone to do the wall, be aware there's a certification. This is from the Dry Stone Walling Association in Great Britain, which is pretty much the world standard for dry stone walling certification. It's widely recognized all over the world. It's what we provide at the Stone Trust. And this is a map of some of the certified wallers in the area. There's 4 different levels of certification from initial to master craftsman. And you're lucky here in New England, there's now, with the Stone Trust being around for about 10 years, 11 years, there's a really good number of certified wallers that can do high quality work for you.
Real quick, Brian, what were the green and yellow pins?
Yellow is initial, green is intermediate.
Okay.
Yeah, from down at the bottom there. Yep.
Not a lot of blue and red in Massachusetts.
Not a lot of blue and red. They're getting there. There's a whole bunch of people, particularly in southern New Hampshire, that are working towards their advanced right now. Probably in another year, they're going to have it.
Brian, I want to give you your 10-minute warning.
Thank you. I'm not too far behind them. That's good. I'm gonna jump into a couple case studies. So this is looking at rebuilding a field wall, and this is in an area in Springfield, Vermont that was actually the first settled area. So this has been farmed again for probably 250 years or more. And this is a section that was rebuilt already. This is what we're rebuilding. In this case, it's a complete rebuild. So we're getting in there with heavy equipment. We're just cleaning the whole thing out. You can do this by hand, but it's a massive amount of work. And again, this wall in places was 10 to 20 feet thick from the amount of stone that they had pulled out. We're getting rid of the trees, any tree that's going to be close to the wall line, because when trees are really hard on walls, not only are their roots expanding as they're growing, but a tree, particularly in a hedgerow like this, when the wind is blowing the top, the roots are heaving underground, and it provides a lot of movement under the walls. So any wall that's going to have, or any tree that's going to have a lot of roots under the wall, we try to get rid of and keep at least 10 feet back. And then this is a wall that we're rebuilding as part of workshops through the Stone Trust. So we have at this point cleared out the hedgerow. The only trees we've left are well back from the wall. They've gone through and they've sorted all their stones, just like in those earlier photos. We've got the biggest stone up near the front, some piles of harding, smaller stone towards the back. They're just prepping the base. And in a field agricultural setting like this, we're not doing any of that gravel or crushed stone. A dry stone wall is designed to be able to flex and move with the ground. So unless you're doing something fancier, just building on the dirt is going to be fine. And that's just being compacted by people stomping on it. Getting into building the wall itself, setting the foundation stones, you can maybe just make out there's a string line there. This is an active, this is a 3-day historic rebuild workshop. A bit farther on, probably afternoon of the second day, we're building our way up on this wall. Again, you can see how we've sorted stone. There's some harding, there's still some building stone there. And there's the completed section of wall, going from that absolute mess of a hedgerow to a nice, this is about 5 foot, 4.5 foot tall dry stone wall there. It's a good example in that case of restoring an old wall completely, probably back to better than it was ever built before. I'm going to take a few minutes here just to look at a barn foundation, and there's lots of different types of foundations. This is a section that was basically a freestanding wall. It wasn't retaining soil under this barn. The carpenters had propped it up with some jacks and blocks of wood and stuff when they were doing some work to this barn. But it was in a really sorry state. These gaps were here. It was just falling apart. That's the other corner. And this is an example you can tell. So just because it's old doesn't mean that it was well built. And they built this corner. There's a complete running joint. Those kind of cross a little bit, but virtually a complete running joint at the corner where we definitely want things structurally tied together. So just because it's old doesn't mean it was well built originally. Dug out with a machine. We're adding in a crushed stone base. In this case, adding in granite blocks at the corner so that we have something really structural to build with. There's and we're adding in an entrance pathway into underneath there. So working with blocks of wood and jacks temporarily to hold things up as we're working across. A bit farther along in the process, working through building under an existing structure is very time consuming. The access is bad and it's a challenge, but it absolutely can be done. Continuing to build up, you got a completed corner there with the granite blocks. You can see the drill holes left in some cases, gives a little bit of sense of history. Now, if you're trying to do an actual preservation job, you might be a little bit more concerned about using existing stone. In this case, the client was interested in not replacing the concrete. He wanted to keep it as a dry stone foundation. And that's what we were able to achieve there. I think that that's a view of the start in the other corner. Working through, you can see the thickness of the walls. If this was a foundation wall that's retaining, very often at the bottom, they're as thick as they are high. So it was an 8 foot high foundation wall. It might be 8 feet thick at the bottom, kind of tapering up the back on a 45-degree angle. This is just freestanding. It's a little narrower. That's the completed job. So introduce a little bit of modern material to increase the strength of the job. And very often with dry stone work, this is as the waller, it's what we will advocate for is let's not rebuild what caused it to fail before. And there's only very specific instances, I think, where the rebuilding it exactly as it was is warranted due to historic preservation. Most often we're going to say, let's build it using the material that was there. If we need to, let's introduce something that's going to be a little bit stronger, but let's keep it as a traditional dry stone work that was built there before. That's another view of the completed barn foundation repair job. And this project, the lead on this project was TJ Mora of Mora Stone, and he had a bunch of us helping him with that as we went around the barn. All right, I'm probably pretty close to the end of my time, so I'm just gonna wrap up with a couple resources that I want to make sure that you have time to copy down. The stonetrust.org, that's the organization that I work for. If you're interested in dry stone walling, I highly recommend go to that website address there. I'm going to plug in, just put your email address in the newsletter feed. That's right on the homepage there, and you'll get on our email newsletter. We don't spam you, but you'll get a lot of information about upcoming workshops, resources for dry stone walls, a huge amount of information there. Register for workshops, all that type of thing. If you need to contact me as well, my contact information you can get from the website. Dry Stone Walling Association of Great Britain, again, a really good resource with additional information. This first book here, Dry Stone Walling, a Practical Handbook, that's what we're going to be raffling off as a door prize. It is kind of the Bible of dry stone walling, particularly with regards to the to the field wall type work. When you get into like house foundations, stuff like that, all the same principles apply, but it's really looking at historic field wall work. And another excellent book by the same author is Stonework. That's kind of the what not to do book. Really good examples of that. That's gonna wrap up my presentation. I think we've got a good amount of time for some questions here. Actually, a few extra moments for questions. So
yeah, Brian, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I'm impressed with your timing here.
Yeah.
There's so much information here. Great information, has definitely inspired me. We have some really good questions. So I'm going to just sort of go through the chat questions. And then if we have time, we will extend the Q&A period after.
Perfect.
Okay. The first one related to, and Andy, thank you. Andy Roper put in a link here for the New Hampshire Stone Wall Project.
Yes, that's
a great project. And
absolutely
put information on walls on your own property, or if you want to research other walls around the state.
Yeah, that's a fantastic project that they're doing. Absolutely.
Yeah. Robin asked a question about, there's a controversy here in Rhode Island whether stone piles and woods are evidence of farming or Native American ceremonial sites. What's your opinion on that?
So I think it brings up something really good that I didn't touch on in terms of history, which is that there definitely is evidence that there was Native American stonework done. There's very little recorded about it, and it's very hard to know what was what and who built what when. So we know that there was a certain amount, maybe a lot, of stonework done by the Native Americans, that perhaps the European settlers came in and started, increasing or building or just tied into what they were already doing. I haven't seen any great, anything that I felt was reliable in terms of defining what was Native American, what wasn't, what was ceremonial, what was practical. It's really hard to know at this point. I would say commonly piles in fields were done more for practical, just getting stone out of the field. And I would say that if you ended up, very often they're on top of a piece of ledge or a boulder that was too big to move, and that's why they were piled there. So if you were, quote unquote, excavating one and you found a big boulder or ledge poking out of the ground and there was a lot of stone piled on top, I'd say that's pretty likely. Occasionally there's some really interesting cairns built in Rochester, Vermont, and there's a lot of quartz in them, which there's no quartz in the native ledge from right around where they were built. And that kind of suggests somebody intentionally brought those pieces of quartz there. And that says, maybe there's some other function beyond agriculture to these walls, but without a written record, it's hard to verify for sure. Hopefully that gives some insight.
All right, another question. Good preventative maintenance for walls. And I have that same question in terms of roots and vegetation and all that stuff. How do you handle that annually?
Ideally, keep trees 10 feet back from your walls. Again, it has to do with those tree roots that are heaving under the wall when the tree's blowing in the wind. In terms of other growth on the walls, it's not really going to affect it one way or the other. And if you're into wildlife, the old walls are great for wildlife, especially if it gets a little shrubby around it and that kind of thing. Preventative maintenance, make sure that the cap or the cope is in good shape. What tends to happen is, if something shifts a little bit and a capstone or cope stones fall off, it loses the weight on top of the wall. So make sure that the capstones are on top. And also a side point, in terms of theft of stone off of your walls, a wall that has a complete cap or cope and it comes to a level line, if someone takes stone off that, it's going to be very obvious. But a wall that's starting to deteriorate, people might think is more free game to steal stone off of. Beyond that, it's when a section starts to really fall down in disrepair, get a waller in to rebuild that section. And that's how some of these walls that are 500 years old, well, probably most of it has been rebuilt multiple times. It's just bit by bit as it was having issues, and that can be a lot better than letting the whole thing turn into a linear rock pile. Beyond that, the beautiful thing about dry stone walls is when they have issues, you can just rebuild them with the same material that's there. And, the worst thing to do really to a wall is to start putting mortar into it, because it's not going to help the structure. The structure is intended to be able to flex, and the mortar is going to prevent it from flexing. It's going to trap water in there, cause even more damage. And then when you go to rebuild it, there's mortar all over the stones. So you either have to spend a lot of time hammering that off or go get new stones. So there's a few things. For the most part, if they're left alone, they tend to do pretty well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's another question. If you have the equipment, is there any issue with using large stones in walls, or do you prefer to use medium to small?
There's no issue with using large stones. And in some cases, large stones can be stronger depending on how they're used, of course. But if you get into, if you think about wharfs and dock structures, ports, they're often done dry stone because mortar doesn't hold up in those environments, and they're done using huge blocks of stone. But no, big stones is fine. It's going to give you a different look. Unless you're doing a tremendous amount of shaping, it'll tend to give you a rougher look, but structurally it's just fine to do. I find that whether you're stacking by hand or with machine, you're going to get your best production rate when you're using stone that's of the size that's about as big as you can comfortably maneuver. So it's faster to build if it's stone that I can comfortably lift, but it's right about as big as I can comfortably lift. And if I'm working with a machine, it's as big as that machine can comfortably lift. That's going to be your most efficient production rate.
Okay, and that leads in well to this next question. Ballpark costs for a 4-foot stone wall using existing material on the property. So basically labor costs. Yeah,
labor costs. It's pretty variable, but I would say it could be anywhere, your common range for a skilled waller to come in and rebuild. If we're talking about a double stack wall, you're probably going to be at least $100 a lineal foot, and it could be up, depending on how refined you want it, it could be up 3 times that, or 4 times that potentially. Probably, I would hope not, but it depends a little bit on access and all kinds of other factors, how tight the fit and finish. I didn't really get into this before, but a lot of people confuse the tightness of the fit and finish, how tightly the stones fit together, with structure. And you can build a stone wall where all your stones are set up on edge like veneer that are fit together beautifully, that'll fall down right away. So be careful about confusing the fit and finish with proper structural stacking. And if you're trying to do proper structural stacking and have an incredibly tight fit and finish, it's going to be very expensive because you're going to be spending a lot of time shaping stone. So there's everybody has the ideal stone wall picture in their head of what they want it to look like, and it can be hard to translate that to the builder. So using example photos and things like that can be a helpful thing.
So when you're hiring a stone waller and you have a particular style in mind, is it good to go out and look at other walls they've built in your area with that type of stone?
Yep, there's a lot of things you can do. You can definitely look at photos of the walls that the contractor has built that you're interested in hiring. Look at other walls, drive over to one of the Stone Trust training facilities. There's one in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, and Dummerston, Vermont, which is right by Brattleboro, probably not too far from a lot of you. You can look at a lot of the stone walls there and get a sense of what you like and don't like. And then also remember, no matter, a stone wall that falls down looks bad. So put structure first. A strong wall will tend to look good, even if given joints look big or something like that to you. By the time the wall is up and standing, it's going to look good generally. And a lot of how it's stacked and the patterning has to do with the stone that you have available. So don't try to make an incredibly refined wall out of, glacial till. It's just going to make everybody unhappy. If you want a refined wall, get some level bedded schist that can get stacked really tightly. So that, there's some aspects like that to think about as well.
So if you have a lot of round stones, I'm guessing it's better to build a double wall.
Yes. Whoops. What happened there? I just lost my slideshow.
That's okay.
I think. Hold on. Let me go back in there. Click the wrong thing here. There we go. Yeah. So if we go back to like one of the photos from the workshop out in, I'll find it here in a second, Minneapolis. There we go. This is very round stone. It's still all set length in, so it's going to be strong. But yeah, you're really going to want to do a double wall. You can do sometimes some of the single stack wall with big round boulders. It might be 3 boulders high. Takes a fair bit of skill to do it, a little bit of shaping. But yes, generally this is a double stack wall, and that's what you're going to want to do with round stone.
Okay. Another participant asked that he has a 6-foot high retaining wall that he built 3 years ago, one section bowing out.
Mm-hmm.
Is the only correction basically rebuilding that whole section? What's the fix?
Yes. So typically I'm just going to jump down here, and of course, I'd get a better sense of it knowing how it was built. My guess is if it's bowing out that quickly, either there's a real problem with drainage behind it, and water is hanging out here, freezing and pushing that wall over, or it was probably built as a single stacks type structure that was just backfilled with crushed stone or gravel or something like that. And there's a couple other, if it had been built vertically originally, it's going to be much more prone to push out as well. There's not a lot that you can do beyond taking it down and rebuilding it. You can do something to help keep water. If you're in a situation where you have surface water coming in, and that's what's causing the problem, you can do something that's called a ground roof, which is often done around old stone foundations, where you would dig up maybe a foot of soil or so, put rubber roofing down, put a layer of crushed stone on top of that, a pipe in there so it can take the water away, put down filter fabric, then backfill with your topsoil on top of that. And the idea is any surface water, and usually right behind the wall or at the foundation, you're going to leave crushed stone showing right to the surface for a foot or two. So any surface water that's going to come down is going to be gathered up on that rubber roofing, go into a pipe, and not come down into the soil and cause pressure that way. So that might be something that could be done, but I'd be thinking about how was that wall built originally. If it was built that recently, it's either there's water problems or there just wasn't enough mass of stone in there for the height of the wall. Or potentially there was just some issues with how it was stacked and there's not enough friction between the stones themselves. That is potentially an issue. There's not a lot that can be done beyond rebuilding it. The good thing is that if it's dry stone wall, the stone is there, you can rebuild it. And it's much easier to rebuild than something like a concrete wall or mortared wall.
Okay, and I think one final question for this initial first hour, and then we can do a few more after. But this one, I think he's asking, can you discuss double walls, which I think maybe is more like range lines? And I think that's what he might be referring to. Also, stone ladders and town fences.
Okay.
Which might be.
There might be some terminology that I'm not sure about.
If I can explain.
Yeah.
My reference is agricultural walls, and you mentioned double walls where the two walls start out together. I've seen walls where the two walls may be apart by 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet.
Yep.
And for agricultural clearing the fields, they fill the center with all the small rough stones.
Yep. Yeah, let me pick up on that first. So what you're describing would be called a consumption wall.
Consumption, okay.
Consumption wall where it's consuming the stone. And oftentimes what you'll actually find in that, it'll start as a double stack wall. Then they'll start adding maybe another stack on the outside and another stack and another stack. Sometimes they'll say, we have so much stone, they come over here, they start building another stack. And as you're describing, just tossing lots of stone in. There's places where those are like 20, 30 feet thick. And they only go up usually about 6 feet high because lifting stone beyond that gets impractical.
Yeah.
Sometimes eventually they'll even do like walking paths or something down the top of them. But that terminology wise would be called the consumption wall. And if you get into actually excavating it or looking at it, oftentimes somewhere in the middle, there's an original double stack wall or at one side of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now on the stone ladders, my dad used to work on the agricultural walls by himself.
Yep.
And he used kind of a offset ladder with maybe 2 or 3 steps so he could walk heavier rocks up to the top.
Got it. Yes. So potentially one of the features that you're referencing, and I don't have a picture of it in this slideshow per se, would be a step style where you leave some long stones protruding from the wall. And these are the through stones, which are often left to protrude a few inches only. But in a step style, there would be one down here protruding, one up here protruding, maybe a fourth one there. And sometimes, if it's a sheep wall, they'd only protrude maybe an inch or two, just enough to get a boot on. If it was in livestock, like for cows, they might protrude a whole foot or so. And it makes a stairway. And then the same stones would protrude on the other side. And you can walk up and over the wall, but the animals can't. That's
but these would be wooden stone ladders.
Okay, so just using some sort of a stair structure or ramp just to roll stones up. Very, very common. We'll use a plank to get stones up, especially when you're dealing like with big cope stones at an end or something. Absolutely.
Working by yourself, you need something like that.
Yep, and especially pre-hydraulic equipment. I do still keep some planks with me for that type of thing. Most often we'll just lift it up with hydraulics now, unless it's somewhere.
Yeah, right. This is pre-hydraulic.
But yeah.
Now, do towns still have fence viewers, or is that kind of a position that's phased out?
Yeah, probably on a lot of them probably do on the books, but I don't want anybody that's
not a lot of work.
Yeah. The more common issues now pertaining to stone walls is stone theft, actually, especially in the roadside walls. And in pretty much all the New England states, I think, except for Vermont, there's a specific law that it is illegal to take stones off of somebody else's wall.
Yeah.
In Vermont, they kind of wrap it in with general property theft. But generally speaking, as a professional, I won't take, even if it's on the property that I'm working, I won't take stone from a roadside wall. I will take stone, to use on the same property from piles that were piled mid-field or mid-property boundary walls, especially if it's a consumption wall. I like taking the stone from the property, using it on the property. That's a nice thing to do, I think, as opposed to trucking stone in. It lowers the carbon footprint, everything. But I try not to completely erase an old stone wall, even if it's an interior wall, unless there's a really good practical reason to do so.
Yeah, we had a flood control area near us, and people just robbed the stone walls.
Yep.
Terribly.
Yep.
All right, I think I'm going to do my wrap up now. For those who do have to leave at 1 o'clock, and again, we'll stay on for another 15 minutes or so with additional questions if you want to continue the discussion. But anyway, thank you so much, Brian. This was really wonderful program, great practical information based on obviously your years of practice building and studying stone walls. We hope everyone has learned some techniques and best practice tips and have inspired you to go out and work on your walls or even build new ones to improve or enhance your property. Now's a great time of the year to do it. We didn't really touch on this, but I know my walls around our property, now's the time to go out and do clearing and cut back of vines and things before everything leaves out. But I forewarn everybody about the PI. We have tons of poison ivy on our walls, so just have to be careful.
Yeah.
We love getting like-minded folks together and to share practical information, make connections, and offer doses of energy and inspiration. Thoughtful and experienced presenters like Brian and your great questions and involvement make a huge impact on advancing preservation interests and efforts across New Hampshire. We want you to know the Alliance is here to help and encourage you to check out our website at nhpreservation.org or send us an email to bt@nhpreservation at any time. If you haven't already done so, please check out our website for a schedule of Expo on the Road programs. Our April lineup includes solar installations on historic buildings, energy efficiency in older homes, and porch history and preservation. We're excited about the lineup and hope you are too. Again, visit our website to learn more and to register for these upcoming events. We hope today's program has inspired you to move forward with your stone wall projects. We look forward to seeing you at future programs. Encourage you to share our Expo website link with others, Old House and Barn enthusiasts. And be sure to check out our Expo guide of 50 products and service providers on the Expo page of our website. And for those of you who have been to our in-person Expo in the past, you know how we love to give away door prizes at our events as a token of our appreciation of your participation. So I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Maggie Steer, to announce the lucky winner of the Dry Stone Walling Practical Handbook, a must read for anybody interested in building or repairing stone walls. So Maggie, the lucky winner is?
The lucky winner is Laurie Jutzi of Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And I don't know if she's still with us or not. If you're on, Laurie, give us a shout. We will mail the book to you. Make sure you get that directly in the mail soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say I was so thrilled to see our car bridge at the beginning of the presentation, which is just down the road from me.
Oh,
it's a
fantastic.
spectacular bridge, and we're very, very proud of it. It's one of the most important landmarks in our town. So thank you for selecting it.
There it is.
And thank you for the prize as well. I really thought the talk was fabulous. I have a lot of really ratty old stone walls here, so we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Lori, do us a favor, and after you restore your walls or even a small section, take a picture and send it to us.
Okay, Beverly, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining. All right.
Absolutely.
So in wrapping up here, please watch for a follow-up email I'll be sending out tomorrow with links to some of the resources that were included in today's program. The 2 Stone Trust handouts that Brian mentioned, some of the information was in his program, and an evaluation that we would ask that you please fill out to help us with future programming. And please keep the Preservation Alliance vibrant by making a donation or consider a gift of membership. And one other question, Brian, before I totally close out here, someone had asked if we will be recording this, we will put it on our website, but someone asked if they could get the slides, like a PDF of the slides. I don't know if you are willing to do that or not.
I think that some of these images are from others, and so I have permission to use them. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I want to send it out to the world.
Yep, that's fine.
All the just because of the rights to the photos, all of the images that like had the terminology and the how-to and everything that you're going to get in the handouts.
Yes.
So you're going to have that, and if there's a specific image that you're looking for, just email me and I'd be happy to send it to you if I can. Absolutely. But
and again, the recording will be on our website,
okay.
So
Yep.
everyone will be able to view the entire thing again if they
Yep.
like.
Great.
All right, so thanks again to Brian and the Stone Trust for this very informative presentation, to our Old House and Barn Expo sponsors, and to all of you for joining today. We wish you well with your work, and most of all, wish you and your family good health. Thanks for joining, and hope you can get out this afternoon and check out your walls. It's a beautiful day. Thanks for joining today, and for those who want to stay on, please do so, and we will address some of these additional questions. Thanks again, Brian.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
And I think we're going to still have quite a few
All right.
participants here staying on for additional questions.
I noticed in the chat, somebody was asking for a photo of a single stack wall. They missed the beginning. This is the one image that I had from in the slideshow of a single stack wall. And that's very typically, you can see a lot of light through it. Sometimes they're called a lace wall. Yeah. They're built with these bigger stones. And often in these walls, they can be fairly tippy and fall down fairly easily. So in the woods, sometimes they look very, very low because the top two stones have fallen off. But usually they would have been built, 3 to 5 feet tall originally. And this one is actually, this is still a pasture area. So there's still a electric fence wire running along with it as well now. But that's a nice old single stack wall.
Yeah.
So Brian, do you know if there's any truth, and I don't know where I heard this, that the sheep walls were a certain height because the sheep above the height of their eyes, because
Yeah.
the sheep won't jump over a wall that they can't see the other side. Is that true?
I have not heard that explanation. There is some validity to a sheep won't try to jump something they think looks unstable. So it's actually interesting. A single stack wall like this that they can see light through, the sheep won't tend to go near that or try to jump that compared to a double stack wall. So these can actually be less high than a double stack wall
Interesting.
in theory, because the sheep won't tend to want to go near that because they think it looks unstable. There was some, I get a lot of questions in some of these presentations about, why are the walls so low now? There was some breeding of some very short-legged sheep in New England for a while, with the idea that the fences didn't have to be as high. And they unfortunately came with some traits that weren't as favorable, but they were called otter sheep and they had very short legs. And the real downfall came when the real practice became to drive your sheep herd down to the city at sale time, and those little legs didn't work so well. But in general, the walls would have been fairly tall, but also remember with the land use patterns, very often they would have been topped originally with some wood or stumps, or it would have been a wooden fence that people started piling stone next to, and then they ended up moving away and that was never finished. There's all kinds of different reasons why a wall might be a given height. And there's some wide variety in sheep breeds as well. The black-faced sheep, often, I've seen them jump like 8-foot fences. They're incredible. But some of the more docile sheep, a 3-foot fence is going to be fine for. So.
Okay, and another question would like you to speak to base compaction in a little more detail.
Sure. I'm just going to get back over to those slides. So the first thing that I want to talk about a little bit with bases, I get a lot of questions about bases, and the number one thing to remember is that no matter how good your base is, if you didn't stack the wall properly, it's not going to work. It's not going to matter. You've got to be following those basic rules that I went over, and whatever else is applicable to the features that you're doing. However, a good base will make a well-built wall last longer. It'll make a poorly built wall last longer too, probably, but don't assume that because you have a good base, you don't have to stack things properly. In terms of compaction in particular, what you're looking for is to get to the point where it's not going to compact any further. And I almost always use, what we're calling clear or clean aggregate as a base. I'll compact the subsoil that's left there too, but you're trying to get something that's not going to settle. And this is for, fancy landscape construction projects, not an agricultural wall. The vibratory plate compactor will typically, this is a small walk behind one, weighs, 150 pounds, 2 people can lift it out of a truck kind of thing. That'll compact about 2 inches down, a 2-inch layer. So if you're going to fill your crushed stone in 2-inch layers and keep going over with your compactor, great, you can use that. But almost nobody does. Really, this is a vibratory plate smoother. And it's great if you're trying to achieve a smooth top surface. If you're trying to achieve compaction, then using these jumping jack type compactors, which is really ramming the material. You can see when I lay down a foot thick layer of crushed stone like I have here, one of these compactors will drive it down about 3 inches. You're getting about 25% smaller in volume. They really do an amazing job. If you're a bigger construction company, you might have like an excavator mounted compactor or something like that. But you can achieve pretty good compaction just driving a loaded pickup truck back and forth with one wheel over your wall foundation, or stomping with your feet is going to do better than one of these vibratory compactors in most conditions. I like to compact it to the point that I can't like stomp my heel into and make a big divot. And that's kind of my field test. If I can stomp my heel in and make a big, huge divot, it's not compacted well. It should feel hard when you're walking on it. A lot of engineers say, you know, with this clean aggregate, they want the fines in it. They want something called, you know, crusher run or sure pack or something like that has all the fines in it. That stuff does compact really hard. The problem is it absorbs a tremendous amount of water. So you'll have huge freeze thaw issues. And when it's thawing out in the spring, it can turn to kind of a putty. So you're better off with the clean aggregate. If that's compacted, it's not going anywhere and animals won't burrow in it. It's a really good material for a wall base. I hope that kind of covered the compaction questions.
I think so. Great, thank you. And here's a new question. In the exposed west of Ireland, they do single stack walls that I've been told they leave holes to let the wind go through. Is there
Yes.
truth to that?
Yes, there is. I've been there. And there's some very, very, very windy spots out there. It's also predominantly a limestone that's not nearly as dense and heavy as some of our other limes, you know, some other types of stone. And there is some truth to it. I think it's hyped up a lot more than it needs to be. But yeah, when you're building a 7 or 8 foot tall fence in a very windy site, and it's a fairly light stone in theory, and you're talking a single stack wall, in theory, the wind could blow that over. Probably not if it was stacked properly. But yes, I have heard that a lot. And I think there's a small grain of truth and probably a lot more hype.
Okay. And then back to the stone steps in the wall, the protrude. Were those built that way to help build the wall, the higher levels of the wall, or were those actually steps for the farmer to get over the wall?
So predominantly they were steps for the farmer to get over the wall. And again, I don't have a photo of a step style in this presentation. That's a through stone protruding. So you can imagine if there was one down here and one up there, it would make a way for the farmer to climb up and over. That's primarily what they were for. On very tall retaining walls, so when you're talking, you know, bridge abutments, multiple story, building foundations on very steep slopes, sometimes you would see a pattern of protruding stones, and it can be from a whole lot of things. Sometimes it was literally to hold the scaffold for building the wall. Sometimes it was to hold beams that were part of a building if it was a foundation wall. Sometimes you'll also see pockets in the wall where they would have the end of a beam or an end of something for a scaffold inserted into the wall as they were building it. Most commonly, though, when you see something like that, it just had to do with getting over the wall if it's in an agricultural field setting.
Okay.
We skipped over 2 questions there.
Okay.
For walls along a property line, do you know if there was a convention as to where the wall was placed with respect to the line?
Oh, that's a good question. So I know a little bit. I know a little bit. I think it's highly variable is the short answer. Often the walls were built really before property boundary issues were that defined, and the wall became known as the property boundary. And traditionally surveyors usually use the center of the wall if they are doing a modern survey. There are instances, and I've seen some around New England, and I've seen some in England as well, where you have, the wall is going down a line, and somewhere along the line, it suddenly shifts like 2 feet over to one side or 3 feet over to one side. And that was a change of ownership of the wall. And so occasionally you'll see something in the woods and be like, what, they've started building from both ends and didn't line up properly or something. And it usually had more to do with the ownership and who was building the wall, and each person was building it on their property. You usually only see that in areas that were carefully surveyed before the walls were built. And since most of the walls here were built pre-barbed wire and most of the surveying was done after that, there's not a lot of those. Sometimes you will also see just another tidbit. You'll see, this structure here that we call a cheek end, where you come to a wall end. Sometimes you'll have that, and then the wall will continue. So in the wall, there'll be a vertical seam very clearly defined. And that is very often a spot where the ownership of the wall changed. So it might be centered on the property line, but the person on one side built here, and then somebody else built from there on, and it's distinguishing who owns that section of wall. Local convention might be a little different than what I'm saying, but that's what I'm familiar with.
Okay.
And then do you want to take the next one, Bev?
Sure. Dry Stone House Foundation from 1816 has stones that are massive. What
Mhm.
means did they use to place them other than oxen?
Ah,
The stones just
so
look like-
yeah, so typically with the big stones, they were primarily moved around with oxen, and they never would have left the ground. They wouldn't have been lifted up. So even if it's in the situation now where it's in what appears to be a freestanding wall, not a retaining wall, they would have actually like made an earthen ramp and dragged the stone up onto the wall, never having it leave the ground. And in a retaining wall situation, they would have just been dragging everything down from above. And they had all kinds of ingenious things with, pins and fulcrums, so you could have the oxen towing away from the house foundation on a horizontal log that has a pin somewhere. It becomes a lever to push the other end closer to the wall. It's really hard to visualize, but just because sometimes the stone was moving opposite the direction of the oxen. I guess I'll put it that way, through these simple machine mechanisms. And bigger foundations, if you're into a mill foundation or some more common in industrial sites or bridge abutments, they would also erect a real simple derrick. You still see these occasionally at quarry sites, old abandoned quarry sites, where it's basically a manually operated crane, and you can lift up and down and swing around and in and out, and they're very portable. You use a couple logs from the site, some basic bits of metal hardware, and you got yourself a little crane. So not usually on a residential property, but on a bigger foundation, you'd see those.
Okay. And then I just wanted to ask this question. I don't know if you know the answer, Brian, but for a stone foundation for a house, for restoration, are you still saying dry stone laid, not adding mortar?
Excellent question. So the very often what was done with the house foundations, they were built dry, and then the inside often at some later point, sometimes at that time, was pointed with mortar or plastered on the inside.
Mhm.
And the key there is that it was done with a lime mortar, not a Portland cement based mortar. And I probably don't have time to get into all the differences, but if you just know that, don't use Portland cement in that instance. You're going to be a long ways towards a successful project. But in general, with a house foundation, you're going down, I'm thinking like full basement type foundation.
Yeah.
You're going down below frost depth. So you're not going to have much movement in the wall at that point, assuming it's reasonably well built. And so pointing the inside of it to give yourself a clean basement wall was a practice that was pretty common in some areas. When I do foundation work now, one of the problems with a dry stone foundation is that it lets a lot of air through. So for heating and cooling, that's a major problem. And a lot of people like to see the stone in the basement. There's all different things that you can do on the inside for your heating and cooling issues, and leave the dry stone alone. But if you do start mortaring, you have to realize that mortaring a wall that it'll give you a clean surface. It's not going to solve any problems with a wall that is already pushing out or having issues. It's going to actually make those issues worse. Particularly if you have issues with water coming into the basement, then mortaring or pointing that wall, even with lime mortar, is completely the wrong thing to do, because it's just going to force the water to build up in the wall itself and prevent it from coming through. So there's a lot of issues to consider. I definitely do build dry stone foundations for sheds and barns and unconditioned airspace buildings. On houses themselves, I usually advocate doing a spray foam interior or something along those lines to get your air sealing and your insulation inside of the stonework rather than trying to mess with the stonework itself.
Except that I have to say, as a
Yeah.
preservation organization,
Don't do that, right?
we're not big fans of spray foam.
Yeah.
It's
it
not
can-
reversible. Plus, it
Yep.
does take away from the I mean, I still love going in my basement and
Yeah.
see all those stones.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just-
I would agree with that. You got to be, and it can also add to a lot of moisture issues. You do have to be really careful with this stuff for sure. And it's not historic by any means. I mentioned a little bit on that retaining wall question about a ground roof. And if you're having issues with water coming through a dry stone foundation, that's a really good practice to follow, where you're using rubber roofing material, buried shallowly, sloping away from the ground with drainage on top of it, going to a pipe so that all the roof water, rainwater, surface water is not going down into the foundation. And that's a really good thing to help with your foundation and the water issues.
Yeah, we did that in a section of ours and it fixed it 100%.
Yep. And you have to be aware, a lot of people with the house foundations too, they want to put, they've got water issues and they want to put drainage in around the house. And they don't realize that stone wall often, like I said, is 8 feet thick at the bottom. And they start excavating with a machine and pulling up all these stones. And they're actually structurally really damaging the wall when they're trying to put drainage in. So that's why, again, the ground roof is a better strategy.
Yeah. All right, Brian, I just realized we're way past our 1:15 time.
goodness.
I know
All
you
right.
probably have other things you want to do.
Yes,
So-
indeed.
That was very generous of you for staying on for the additional 15 minutes. So again, thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Brian and Maggie, for helping out. Maggie from the Preservation Alliance. I will be sending the follow-up email tomorrow with the link and all this other great resource information.
Great.
And feel free to reach out at any time. And as Brian said, he can be reached at the Stone Trust. And we wish you all well with your stone wall projects and foundation projects. And we love to see photos. So if you want to send pictures, feel free to do that and we'll post them. So
All
thanks,
right.
thanks to everyone for joining. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you all.
Have a great afternoon.
You
Great
too.
job. Thank you.